Contrary to what you might have heard, right, it's actually impossible to vote like a Black feminist or a radical. Hi, I'm Brendane. I am a scholar and storyteller from Columbia, South Carolina. And in this episode of Black Love Free Behind the Mic, and for those of you who are catching me on YouTube, hey, I'm going to discuss the coercion and self-betrayal that has been renamed as nuance, compromise, campaigning, or even strategy on the progressive left and in Black feminist spaces. And so, if you were anxious about voting, particularly because people or organizations have been telling you that you should either vote or die or vote or lose everything, right, then this video will provide some context and some language for what you've been experiencing, which is, in short, coercion. So before we get into the nitty gritty of things, I want to start by giving some background about myself so that you, wherever you're watching this or listening to this, know where and how I enter into this conversation. So for the past 13 years, I've done racial justice and gender justice political work that includes organizing, scholar activism, scholar advocacy, and healing justice work. I am a Black, queer, cis, gender nor expansive disabled woman from an impoverished background. And though I've gotten an education, I have my PhD, right? I can no longer claim poverty. A lot of my analysis comes from having that kind of upbringing. And I think it's important to note that because there are so many folks who are running around in organizing spaces who claim to have experiences that they don't have or they don't currently have. And so I think it's important to be transparent about that. And like I said, I have a PhD in anthropology. I'm also a trained minister. I did ministry school when I was a teenager. And so I spent quite a few years studying the Bible. And I no longer practice Christianity now. I'm now a student of African and Black indigenous spiritual traditions. But my study of Christian culture really influences how I understand and study culture, particularly in Black communities. I also hold a decolonial abolitionist Black feminist politic. That means that I am anti borders, right? I'm anti prisons, I'm anti military, I'm anti the police, right? I am an anarchist, and I believe that anti Blackness is one of the structuring logics of the world that is. And so, what this also means is that I don't think that the nation state should exist, right? So, I'm not going to put forth any kind of theory or arguments for the continuance of the nation state. I don't think that the police, the military, or the criminal legal system should exist. I hold a firm, intractable belief in the self-determination of Black and other oppressed peoples. And I believe that these institutions, like the military, the police, the criminal legal system, the university, and others, fundamentally undermine the pursuit of Black liberation. So today's video comes from years of experience that I've had as a survivor of interpersonal violence and a scholar of violence and political movements. And it comes from a deep desire to really say, like, hold the fuck up, what the fuck is going on here? If we're truly trying to get free, why are we going about it in these coercive ways? And so I introduced myself in this way for a few reasons. And mainly it's around accountability, transparency, and authenticity, as these are some of my values. You cannot hold me accountable if you don't know who I am or where I'm coming from, right? And this is akin to a practice that we do in the South where we ask people where their people are from, right? We might ask you who your mama is, where your mama from. And because I've shared these things, you now have the power, right, as a viewer or as a listener, to choose whether you will continue to engage with my content and how you'll engage with it. So you know upfront whether you and I might be aligned with each other, right? And I think that in this age of misinformation, it's important to know and to understand when and where people enter into these conversations. We are going to be hearing so much more about who we are and how we should show up in community and in society now that the election is finished, and now that things will change for all of us. And so having this information about people at the least, right, will save you some time, and at the most can save you your life. And so I want to bring these topics and things from my own vantage point as an anthropologist. But these are things that I've already talked about in the podcast Black Love Free. And so if you're interested in learning more about the topics that we'll discuss today, listen to my podcast, which explores the intersection of Black and African Indigenous spirituality and healing and Black feminist political theory. And the most relevant episodes are the second episode, Surrendering Fear, the third one, Surrendering to Death, the eighth one, Surrender to Freedom, and the ninth one, Surrender to Change. I will link the episodes in the description box for those of you who would like to learn more. They'll also be included in the show notes for those of you who are listening or watching this from Substack. We can go ahead and get started. And so the first thing that I want to do is build a container for this particular conversation. And this container that I'll build is one that comes from my own viewpoint as an anthropologist, right? We'll be looking at culture, we'll be looking at society from this kind of zoomed out lens. And then we'll be moving back and forth between the more zoomed out aspects and to the more interpersonal aspects. So I want to start with just the statement that we live in a structure of violence. And so our relation to the government, our relationship to each other, right, are structured by power, domination, and abuse. And so when you hear organizations or people act as if our current moment kind of arose from nowhere, right, we are actually not in some especially critical moment, right? This current moment is centuries in the making. And so it's important for us to contextualize what we have been experiencing in this election cycle and even in the ones before it within our country's history and culture. Because we live in a structure of violence, coercion, self-abandonment feel natural. It's actually what keeps this kind of power and domination and violence going. And it permeates the atmosphere and shapes so much of what forms society and reality that we can't even readily name it or face it. And we hold all of these cultural beliefs and values that hierarchical rule and coercive authority are natural. And all relationships tend to be based on power and domination because of this belief. And so we usually can easily identify violence and abuse in romantic and familial contexts, but it's important for us to think about, right, that violence just doesn't spontaneously sprout up from interpersonal relationships or familial experiences, right? It's important to understand that all of this violence is connected and that is connected to the violence that is put forth by the nation state. So Black feminists have been drawing the connections between violence of the state and interpersonal violence for decades. I think one of the clearest writers about this is Bell Hooks. And Bell Hooks writes in her essay, A Feminist Movement and Violence, and I'll quote her here. I believe that violence is inextricably linked to all acts of violence in this society that occur between the powerful and the powerless, the dominant and the dominated. While male supremacy encourages the use of abusive force to maintain male domination of women, it is the Western philosophical notion of hierarchical rule and coercive authority that is the root cause of violence against women, of adult violence against children, of all violence between those who dominate and those who are dominated. It is the belief system that is the foundation on which sexist ideology and other ideologies of group oppression are based. They can be eliminated only when this foundation is eliminated. And so at the time that Bell Hooks wrote this, she's speaking to the general feminist community where most feminists, and most of them were white, right, believed that the biggest problem or the biggest amount of violence that they experienced in their lives was the male abuse of women inside and outside of romantic relationships. And what Bell Hooks does expertly in this essay that I highly recommend that folks read is point to all the ways in which state violence, interpersonal violence, and other forms of violence are linked together to produce a society in which violence is literally the atmosphere in the air and something that we cannot really interrogate or tear apart. And so she goes on to say the social hierarchy in white supremacist capitalist patriarchy is one in which theoretically men are the powerful, women the powerless, adults the powerful, children the powerless, white people the powerful, Black people and other non white people the powerless. In any given situation, whichever party is in power is likely to use coercive authority to maintain that power if it is challenged or threatened. And if you're interested in understanding more about the connections between a kind of culture of violence or structure of violence and the ways that violence shows up in interpersonal relationships, I would encourage you to look at some of the resources that are linked in the Substack of show notes or in the description box. But I want to talk a little bit more about specifically about the cultural beliefs that really sustain the structure of violence that we see in society, but also these logics that mobilize what those of us who consider ourselves to be on the left or part of radical Black feminist spaces we're experiencing during this election season. And I believe we'll experience much more um, as things progress. And so the first thing, and in this kind of culture of violence for us to hold on to, is that our current government, right, the current nation state in which we live, was formed through anti-Blackness, was formed through anti-indigeneity, was formed through a kind of a capitalist economic system, right, formed through slavery and colonialism. And so a government, a structure that was built on the backs of our ancestors, through the backs and the wombs and the blood of our ancestors, right, is one that by virtue of that, right, cannot last forever. But I'm not going to go down that road, right? What I'm saying and what's important from that, right, is in order to justify doing that kind of world ending, world annihilating, and world shifting violence against colonized people around the world, right, Europeans had to create a binary logic that divided the world into the civilized and the uncivilized, the citizen and the non citizen, the human and the non human, the saved and the damned, the victims, the perpetrators, right, the dominators and the dominated. Alongside this kind of binary understanding and view of the world, which undergirds our understanding of violence, right, Europeans also instituted a capitalist economic system that made sacrificing those that were deemed as unworthy or unfit disposable. And they made their disposability a necessity for the survival of capitalism. Right? Capitalism requires the destruction of the world. White supremacy, patriarchy, anti-Blackness, and other forms of oppression like homophobia, transphobia, ableism, xenophobia, etc. All of these actually provide a reasoning and a structuring logic for that destruction, right? And what these systems of oppression and these institutions of oppression do is they place life, human and non-human, right, on a spectrum of proximity to death, right? And we might call that spectrum of proximity to death marginalization, right? And through the lens of anti-Blackness, right, they position Black people, things associated with Blackness as death or as close to death as death can get. And these systems, these institutions, then dictate that you, right, as the individual, which is the kind of capitalist Christian invention, right, are responsible for your own life and you're responsible for society's failings. And so these understandings are key elements of white supremacy culture. And you also might see elements of this, right, in the domination, isolation, and control of an abusive interpersonal relationship. Another part or piece of this culture is a Christian, fascist, and imperialist value system. And so, even though we all might have been taught, right, that the church is separate from the state, right, the values of Puritan Christianity, right, are part of this nation's origin myth, right? They left on the Mayflower to escape persecution from the church and landed here and started their own new world, right? And so these values that are in the Bible, that are in Christianity, and what made it such a powerful tool of colonization was that it taught believers to accept abuse, violation, and domination as normal aspects of life, right? If the God of your religion, right, is jealous, dominating, all powerful, and your creator, but then creates you to be less than, creates you with a piece of you that is missing, that can only be filled with Him, with His word, right? Makes you by virtue of your birth sinful and unworthy, and then says the only way that you're able to commune with Him, right, is through a sacrifice of His only Son, right? These logics undergird your own thinking and around sacrifice, right? It structures a society where individuals might believe and might be willing to sacrifice any and everything to get to this imaginary or amorphous heaven, right? And with Christianity, particularly white supremacist Christianity, right, comes a fear of death, this fear of eternal death and damnation, right? That lake of fire, that if you don't do right, that is where you're going to be. You're either right or wrong. You're either damned or saved, right? And so this eternal death and damnation is a punishment for life without God. And so if we think about this, right, and all of these things nested together, within this context, you have the creation of the ultimate saved or savable being, right? This person is recognized as human. They're recognized as a citizen. They're recognized as someone who is powerful, who dominates, who moves through the world and chooses violence, so to say, right? And within this context, the rights that the nation state will tell you are so incredibly important to fight for, the rights that they say that your ancestors sacrificed their life for, right, are only important or matter within a white supremacist, anti-Black paradigm of humanity and citizenship. Rights are inventions that keep us tied to the nation state and keep us tied to the state power through the power of coercive authority and control. Because the truth is, right, that even though folks will tell you that voting is exercising your power, right, that the right to vote is a sign of power and something worth fighting for, right, rights are not synonymous with power. If your oppressor can dictate how and when and why you use your power, right? You every 2 years at the first Tuesday of November for 8 hours, you have the power to change the world and change your life, right? Then baby, that's not power. That's an allowance. And so when we are thinking or engaging with the political work that is coming out, particularly on the left, right, we have to be thoughtful about how they're talking about rights, right? Rights are not things that people should be dying for. And if we think that the state or our oppressors are going to give us life by us just exercising our power when they ask us to or make it available to us, right? then we're missing out on really the point of fighting for power, right? We have to claim our self-determination by force because this world was forged through force, domination, and violence. And so the binary thinking that is part and parcel of this European Christian fascist worldview, right, is basic to all forms of social domination in Western society, according to bell hooks, right? And this dualistic thinking actually allows coercion to happen and it makes it easier. And one of the things that has come up, right, as we've seen in these conversations, has been this it's either you or me mindset or thinking that has come with the construction of rights, right? We're told that if we don't vote for our rights, we'll lose them. Or if we don't vote against this thing, we'll lose that because capitalism, white supremacy, anti-Blackness, all these forces of oppression construct a world in which, right, it's either you and me through the kind of rules and parameters and paradigms of scarcity that allow capitalism to exist. And so these systems will tell you that you alone have this power to do all these things, right? But it can only be exercised through voting in this particular kind of way. And they'll try to separate you from community organizing, community forms of power, and make you invest in the lie that there are no options for freedom outside of what the state has told you, right? And this isolation is a major tool of domination. And it really, really grows in its power, right, from the creation of a Christian capitalist European concept of the individual, which is different from the Black feminist or African indigenous concept of the self that is deeply connected to community and community power. So these are the kind of big picture cultural beliefs, right, that frame how we approach domination, how we approach power and authority, right? These are some of them. But there are also other cultural beliefs that sustain the structure of violence that we experience from the state and also within our interpersonal relationships. There are many, way too many for me to spend time in this YouTube video or on this Substack really going into. Um, but I'm going to just highlight a few today so that we can better understand the way that coercion is being used by the government, by political parties, and by Black feminist groups to force us to participate in civic participation that's against our values and undermines our self-determination. So the first thing that I want to do is define violence versus abuse. And so violence is a wide sweeping category, right? That speaks to harm that can happen on multiple levels, right? You have emotional, physical, psychological, state sanctioned, state violence, all different kinds of violence, right? And so, what we're talking about today is a pattern of abuse that stems from this structure of violence that we talked about, right? And so, abuse is defined as treating a person or an animal with cruelty or violence, especially regularly or repeatedly. In survivor centered and survivor led platforms, right, abuse is a pattern of behavior. So you might experience a violent event once or twice in your life. And that doesn't necessarily constitute abuse, right? Someone can mistreat you, they can be violent towards you, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's abuse. Violence becomes abuse through repeated cruel violent actions of an institution and or a person that increase their power and control over your body, your mind, your spirit, and your heart. So coming from this understanding of abuse, right, I want to also open our thinking around what is central to how we understand abuse in a Western concept or society. So we have in the society, right, through this kind of binary definitions, we have the traditional abuser victim paradigm prioritizes a perfect victim. This perfect victim is usually a white woman, right, who encapsulates white femininity, and then she's able to occupy this ultimate position of victim at the expense of, right, everyone else who may experience violence or abuse, right? And what it also does, right, is it actually prevents us from being able to really see how the state and other actors are perpetrators of violence, because you have one abuser, one victim, right? One individual person who's causing harm or violence, and one or maybe a few more people who might be victims of that, right? This paradigm requires us to believe in a zero sum understanding of power, where the abuser or the oppressor has all of the power and the victim or the oppressed has none. And this understanding of power as a binary is what allows for coercive control to happen. And I think that it's actually really essential for us who participate in Black liberation, like I'm just talking to us right here, right? For us to move away from trying to be recognized as victims of oppression by the state, right? It actually doesn't serve us to occupy a victim place, because then that means that we are giving our power, right, up to the state. And so we need to move away from seeing ourselves as victims of oppression and thinking about ourselves as active participants in our liberation, in which we shape the world around us, right? And actually have an active role in our freedom, so that we're not waiting for the state to free us. And so this leads me to what I see in a lot of different movements, not just in Black feminist movements or in Black liberation movements in general, but a lot of oppressed folks, right? Is victim thinking. And so victim thinking is partly what allows or enables coercion to happen. If your abuser or oppressor can get you to believe that you have no options outside of what they give you. They can get you to believe that you have absolutely no power whatsoever, and that you are going to be consistently subjected to the harm that they place on you, right? Then you won't even try to leave the relationship if it's an abusive relationship, right? You won't even try to leave or get free, right, from these oppressive institutions. Coercion then becomes a part of your life. It becomes a part of your lived condition. You get used to giving up the things that you want. You get used to giving up your needs, to ignoring yourself, because you don't see yourself as someone who has the ability to free yourself from your situation. And so the depression, the anxiety, and the shame that you feel from the consistent erosion of your sense of self and your integrity becomes normalized and is reinforced in society through victim blaming. And so victim blaming is different from victim thinking, right? Victim blaming is telling someone that the domination, violation, abuse, harm, etc., that they experience is solely their fault and is thus their shame, right? So I will say that right here and right now, for those of you who are listening who may be victims or survivors of violence, right? There is no shame in someone hurting you. The shame for violence belongs to the perpetrator of violence. The shame of racism belongs to the state. The shame of anti-Blackness belongs to the state. The shame of belongs to the state and to the person who committed the right. The only reason why it's not placed on the dominator, on the perpetrator of violence, is because the world that is, right? The world in which we live is structured through these logics of domination and violence. So in order to be powerful in this world, right, you have to commit to acts of violence. You have to commit to acts of coercion, to commit to acts of harm. And that is the only reason why shame is not readily placed on people who cause harm. And part of how we'll free ourselves, right, is giving that shame back to who the fuck it belongs, right? Part of how we will change our lives and change our world is letting go of the shame of being oppressed, right? Letting go of the shame of experiencing violence, right? And allowing ourselves to reclaim our power. So the last kind of set of cultural beliefs and definitions that I want to go through before I talk about what's happening on the left and in Black feminist spaces in particular is the I guess the academics would call it a dialectic, but really the interconnected relationship between coercion and self-betrayal or self-abandonment. And so coercion is defined as the practice of persuading someone to do something by using force or threats. And coercive control is an act or a pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation, and intimidation, or other abuse that is used to harm, punish, or frighten a victim. So coercive and controlling behavior is at the heart of domestic abuse. And as we've heard from bell hooks earlier, right, coerced authority and control are at the heart of, or at the center of, all of the violence that is interconnected within the Western state. And so what's important to understand about coercion, right? If we're moving away from victim thinking and from the false belief that folks have no power in these kind of coercive, abusive, violent situations. And of course, I want to asterisk here, right? I'm not speaking about acts of war. I'm not speaking about acts of violence against children, right? I'm not speaking about acts of violence against those who are truly unable to defend themselves, right? In those contexts, I'm talking about these particular contexts in which coercive authority is used to manipulate and control oppressed populations in particular ways, right? And so coercion can only work, right, when it is coupled with self-betrayal and self-abandonment. And self-betrayal and self-abandonment usually happens in the context of coercion due to a fear of scarcity, right? This fear that there's not enough people to love, there's not enough resources to go around, that it is truly a capitalist zero-sum world in which either it's me or it's you, right? That's scarcity, right? And death. So the fear of death is part of what animates self-betrayal and self-abandonment and allows for coercion to have the power that it has. And so what is self-betrayal, right? Self-betrayal is when we ignore our needs and usually for others. So this behavior can look like committing to one-sided connections, denying and minimizing your own needs to preserve a relationship, lack of healthy boundaries, people pleasing, adopting the beliefs of others in order to be accepted, lack of trust in oneself, and agreeing to do things that we don't want to do. And so if you're here, right, you hear those behaviors, I wonder how many of them you may have committed to or done to participate in this election cycle. Moving forward. Self-abandonment is when you reject, suppress, or ignore a part of yourself in real time. So in other words, you might have this desire or need that you want to meet. And often on the spot, when faced with some kind of choices, whether real or imaginary, right, you make the decision not to meet your own needs. And so folks who routinely self-abandon believe that their needs do not need to be met, and or they might believe that someone else should meet these needs. And so I know for those of us who are survivors of abuse, we can understand what self-abandonment and self-betrayal intimately feels like in our interpersonal connections. But I'll say this, right? When we zoom out, look at society, right? And think about the madness, especially over the last, oh, this year. uh, Folks saying, right, that it's your moral responsibility to betray yourself and your values, to vote for any candidate who is misaligned with your values or risk death and destruction is coercion, flat out, right? And that coercion transforms into power and control when we allow our lives to be dictated according to these terms, right? When we lock into the self betrayal and the self abandonment, that then will say, oh, well, yeah, I guess if insert organization here says that if I don't vote, I'll die. And then you feel the panic around, "Oh, well, I don't want to die, but I also don't want to vote for this person who says they don't give a fuck about my life. And I don't want to do this and I don't want to do that." You get trapped, right, into these cycles of self abandonment because you're told that that's the right thing to do. And it's not. In no world where Black people will be free should we be asked to betray ourselves. And I think that's part of what's led us here as well, right? For hundreds of years, Black people have been trapped in cycles of self-abandonment and self-betrayal because we've looked to others to save us. We've looked to the government to save us, the same government that enslaves us to save us. We look to the same organizations that require some of us to be poor, some of us to be without nothing, some of us to have everything in order to see Black people as valuable, to tell us that this is the path for liberation. And with that, we have undermined our own ability to save ourselves. We have to let go of the cultural beliefs that disempower us. We have to truly believe that we don't need to capitulate to the terms of our oppressors, that we don't need to self-abandon and self-betray, to fall into these cycles of coercive control and authority in order to have the car, the house, the education, the whatever, right? There is no shame in being victimized, right? But we also must understand that there is no glory, no true glory in being martyrs. But under a Christian worldview, right? Sacrificing yourself, because that's what Christ did, and sacrificing yourself for the good of everyone else is seen as valuable and necessary. But when we look at the path to liberation, right? That self-sacrifice is what undermines us seeing freedom. So, as Kenyatta A.C. Hinkle or Olomidara Yaya of the Evanescence Tarot says, it's one of my favorite quotes. Our ability to be in pain mentally, spiritually, and energetically is not an indicator of our strength. Letting go of the pain by surrendering its lessons is. So let's learn and let it go. So one of the little jokes that I've been saying about this, and especially as someone who is tuned in to a lot of radical Black feminist spaces, as someone who writes radical Black feminist scholarship, who reads a lot of scholarship, when I would get online and see these ridiculous ass posts or campaigns or these calls for nuance or strategy on behalf of someone who doesn't need me to do no kind of special thinking, it reminded me of, I don't know if y'all saw the Tyler Perry movie, Family Reunion. It's the same movie where Cicely Tyson is out there yelling at people from the porch, telling them, get your shit together. You're disgracing our ancestors. It's the same movie as Lynn Whitfield, where she's there and she is the mother to two daughters. And you learn in the movie that she's this very abusive mother who essentially sacrificed one of her daughters, allowed her daughter to experience a lot of violence to keep the family going. And then the other, she treats like a princess. She invests all this time and energy into her. And of course, they're both light skinned and, all those other politics, right? But the discourse that I was seeing from these kind of Black feminist radical organizations and other organizations was akin to that scene when Lynn Whitfield is crying to both of her daughters about how she sacrificed so much, and the daughter was telling her like, well, I'm getting my ass beat by this man, like, you want me to continue to be in this relationship? And she essentially tells her to shut up. I gave you everything. Shut the hell up. I gave you everything. Everything I did was for you to have this good life, for you to have all the things I didn't have. And you're going to sit here and complain about all the sacrifices I made? Girl, you better keep getting beat so you can have nice things. And so the discourse, right? All of the coercion, right, that's been happening. We're already in a coercive relationship with the state, right? Like, if I don't pay my taxes, I'm not gonna get I'm not gonna be able to feed myself, right? I'm going to have to give up everything I own. They're gonna take my hard-earned money away from me. And so we're already in this coercive relationship with the state, with the nation state. So when these organizations that are supposed to be about liberation join the coercive control and authority bandwagon, it gets a little anxiety inducing, right? You feel a little gaslit. You feel like, what's real and what's not? Is this really about freedom? Right? And I think part of the issue, part of the problem, is the way that some of these organizations have invoked the memory of our ancestors. So at some point, somebody told niggas that their ancestors fought for the right to vote, died for the right to vote. So that's why we should vote, because our ancestors died for it. And as someone who has a relationship with my ancestors, right? My ancestors have never said nothing to me about voting because they died for that. Like, my ancestors didn't die to vote. They died because they lived in an anti-Black, white supremacist, capitalist, ableist, etc. system that required their deaths no matter whether they voted or not, right? And so people pointing to this unnecessary sacrifice, because it actually doesn't make sense, right? If we really think about it, why would valorize folks dying to be able to cast a ballot? Right? So I wonder if folks who are constantly citing that unnecessary sacrifice have a relationship with their ancestors. Our ancestors can speak for themselves. They can. They do. Right? And it's up to us to build a relationship with them. And especially as the world is turning and changing, right? We are going to need to have a relationship with our ancestors so that no one can gaslight us on their behalf, so that no one can tell you what your ancestors want for you but them. So if you don't already have a relationship with your ancestors, get one. That way no one else can speak for them to you. And none of these orgs, none of these campaigns, none of these slogans can use them, right, to get you to do something that you don't want to do. Now I want to talk a little bit about the kind of democratic Black feminist org parallels to abusive relationships. And so we'll move back and forth between the state level or the kind of high level and the interpersonal. But I want to give more, like, let's talk about this because what the fuck is going on, right? And so understand, right, that for both sides, if we're going to think in this binary, right, both sides of the American political system benefit from Trump running for president. And right, there some of the reasons are different, some of the reasons are the same, right? The strategy of keeping Trump, even though he's illegitimate, unfit, whatever, right, as a candidate works. With Trump as a boogeyman for the left, right, liberals will continue to have this kind of moral baseline from which they can make similar decisions, right, as right-wing people, but feel better about them, right? As long as they're not the loud, brash, openly and overtly racist, right-winged person who follows Trump, right, then they can make similar decisions, but with different reasons, right? And call those decisions more moral. Liberals tend to have this fear of being bad, right? That's also steeped in white supremacist culture, the idea of good versus bad and or of death. And this fear keeps them in this kind of abusive, toxic relationship with the Democrats, right? Where the Democrats can promise to meet some of your needs but not meet them, right? Those on the right, even though I don't really deal with them, this video's not for them, right? But those on the right can feel affirmed for their views and feel like they're getting a leader that's aligned with their values, right? With Trump as their candidate. And so leftists can feel, right, that they're making a moral choice that is better because at least their candidate is not this horrible hellion bashing, right? Um, and they can feel better even if the impact of their decision is the same. So in this way, right, their good intentions, right, become a substitute for actual principled action and engagement. The folks on the left talk about voting pragmatically, right? They talk about, well, what can we do right here, right now? Not even to make things better, but just to keep shit the way it is, right? And folks on the right don't have to be pragmatic with their votes because no matter who's in office, they're going to get what they want. Their needs are going to be prioritized, right? This is because their values undergird the fabric of the nation, right? Their values are part and parcel of what created the US nation state, right? And they organize to ensure that they remain prioritized in all campaigns. So even the campaigns on the left are trying to figure out how to meet the needs of those who've already established themselves as enemies of the constituents of the left. And so those of us who are in need of a government that serves us, right? Then we're put in this position of being the victims, or as I said in my live, the clowns who fawn, right? And start to believe that self-betrayal is the only way to get at least some of what we need. And so that self-betrayal that then becomes renamed as nuance, where folks will say, well, she's not a racist, so she must be better than him. And I mean, she only put 102 people in jail and not 1,000. And I mean, if you really think about it, it's not really exactly what you think because of all of these reasons. Or if we move the goalpost a little bit, then it's not really as bad as you think. It's nuance that we're being asked to employ in this moment, and that will be continued to ask to employ when the Democrats show us again that they are not here to meet our needs. It's also what allows these leftist groups to maintain a sense of morality, right? Because they're coming from a good place. We just don't have everything we need to make what we need happen. People can feel better being complicit in genocide, right? Because they're making a principled choice not to act in accordance with their values for this undefined greater good. And so if we think back, right, to those Christian values that dictate that you must give up or ignore or deny your needs and yourself for heaven, this actually makes sense, right? Within that logic, this understanding of nuance, this understanding of self-sacrifice and self-betrayal makes sense. But what it really does is put us in a kind of emotional whiplash, right? That keeps us entrapped in cycles of domination and abuse. What's also interesting about this time is that we're really starting to see these failures of individualistic, capitalistic thinking, right? Because you kind of have to believe and remain entrapped in European binaristic cultural understandings of the individual, right? In order to believe, right, or to pretend like the underlying logics of fascism, anti-Blackness, white supremacy, patriarchy, all these other forms of oppression, right, that undergird our political system don't exist, and that these conditions wouldn't produce both big party candidates, right? You kind of have to believe in the creation of an individual that is separate from the system, right? In order to think that the system would produce two people who could run for president who would have very different views. And if you look at presidents in the past, right, beyond this current election, it was never two candidates that had very different views, right? These were two candidates that were produced from the same oppressive system who might have differed on a couple or a few key issues, but then their differences, right, still ultimately led to the oppression and marginalization of people in the US and in other countries. But when we adhere to these logics, right, we can continue to point to individual villains, right? We can say Trump is the villain, right? And we can say, well, at least this other candidate is not this individual villain, right? They have these other identity markers, they have these other life experiences. And even though they're in the same kind of structural position as this horrible person, they're not this horrible person. So they're better, right? But then we start to pull back that veil, right? And we see that the morality of it is fabricated. This idea of a better, right, candidate is fabricated. And it requires an investment in those kind of logics of thinking and a stake in the system that produces them. Because ultimately, what does it mean to be better than someone with whom you agree? And we've reached a point now where we must question, right? What good are morality and ethics now in the unveiled face of death? And we really think about it, right? It's like if the bar is always Trump, and that's what I was hearing most about the other candidate, right? Is that, well, at least she's not Trump. Trump can't even speak two sentences coherently. She's coherent. So clearly, she's the better candidate. Uh, Trump wants to bring slavery back, and she hasn't said that. So clearly, she's a better candidate, right? So the bar is always Trump, right? If the question is always, what would Trump do? Then it doesn't really matter who wins the election or who sits at the top of the pyramid of US society, right? Because the values that he represents will continue to structure the government, the criminal legal system, and people will always be comparing their decisions to him. AH has even said that she will be a better imperialist. She'll be a better warmonger. She'll be a better border builder. But at least she'll protect white women's right to abortion, right? When it even came to trans rights, she'll come in just shy of the right-winged establishment and tell folks to follow the law. But what does that mean when the law legislates your death? What good does it do to be the better person if the outcome is death for you and your allied communities, right? The communities that you are supposedly in solidarity with? So if we go back to the kind of comparison to abusive relationships, what we see is Trump is presented as the narcissistic ex who clearly isn't the right choice, right? It's like, yeah, some of my girlies, y'all might know this. Like, it's like that ex that you're like, ooh, why did I even let him do the things that he did, right? He's loud, he's violent, he's overtly abusive, overtly narcissistic, right? The Democrats kind of weighed in, right, as the suitor and current partner, because again, we are under a Democratic presidency, right? The current partner who walks better, talks better, maybe they smell a little better, maybe they're a little less orange, maybe their makeup is a little bit more on point, right? That seems to be the better choice. They are the good man who promises to be better than the others, right? You can think about the accomplishments and the history of the past that they have, right? And they say, because of that past, I will meet your needs, but don't ask for nothing. Right? Don't need anything. I'll meet your needs, but only if you don't ask for anything. And when you point to the ways that he's hurting you right here and right now, and not just living in what was given to you in the past, right? He can only remind you of the past or point to an undefined future. And so when you have to start digging into the past so that you can remember the last good thing that the Democrats and or that nigga that you was with did to you to keep the relationship going, baby, you might be in an abusive relationship. When all the good things are in the past and you are the only person who's bringing that good forward into the present, then you might be in an abusive relationship. So when the Democratic Party's slogan, platform, justification for existence and running and getting your vote again is damn, aren't I better than that last nigga? And you kind of have to point to things in the past to say, yeah, sure, maybe. You might be in an abusive relationship. What's unfortunate about this, right, is that the Democrats can and will continue to move right because they know that their constituents, their victims, will continue to gaslight themselves and coerce others to come along. Because that is what folks do, right? When they are in abusive situations, they find reasons to continue to be in that cycle of abuse. Right? So you might have heard folks describe voting for KH and other left leaders as compromise, campaign, and our strategy. They will say that voting is a part of some strategy, but they provide no transparency about what the following steps are, right? They kind of say vote, that's the strategy. Voting is the strategy. Vote, and then we will get her to move left. Vote, and we will da, right? The thing is, something cannot be a strategy if there is no plan, right? Because then it's like, okay, what are we strategizing for? What are we moving towards? We can't strategize to nowhere, right? So saying that voting against your values and your own self-determination is strategy is a type of future faking, right? That invests you in a potential change without any tangible efforts for change. And future faking is a common tactic that abusers and oppressors use to keep the abused and the oppressed entangled in a cycle where they maintain their power and the abused and the oppressed continue to give up theirs. Well, so a plan actually requires for those who participate and create it, right, to agree on an endpoint, a goal, or a destination. Folks have not done that. Some folks, right, decided the destination is the maintenance of the status quo. The status quo that is already killing Black, queer, and trans teens. The status quo that is already killing Black mothers. The status quo that is already arresting and silencing students. Right? That's the end point. That's the goal. Let's just keep the status quo. We've also seen here in this dynamic, right, is people applauding each other for maintaining this hard, pragmatic line of voting for Kamala without, going against their values. And it's just so difficult. It's just so hard. It's so hard. And it's like, whoa, when did it become hard to be centrist? Like, is it hard to betray your professed values, or is it hard to actually admit publicly and to yourself that self-betrayal is a part of your politic? Folks will say, this is pragmatic, this is pragmatism, right? But pragmatism will always be an enemy to liberation because it assumes and it takes up a fear of scarcity, right? And it assumes that the resources that you have now, the power that you have now, the space that you have now will never change. So the Democrats don't even have to promise you anything new. They only have to promise that you'll keep what you have, that they'll maintain the status quo. What does it mean? That those who profess to be radical actually espouse a politic of self-betrayal and attempt to coerce others into a politic of self-betrayal and pragmatism that ultimately prevents the transformation that we need. So tell me it's true. I need to know, can I go there with you?